bloodline is a cord that can either anchor an empire or hang it. A legacy shattered in the silent, sterile space between a father's hope and a traitor's ambition. In the hushed, traditional grandeur of the Kang estate's private study, where power was passed through generations like a sacred blade, a deception was unfolding heartbeat by heartbeat. Benny felt it in the heavy stillness of the room, a dissonance in the house's ancient, curated honor. She moved through the shadows with a practiced invisibility, a ghost in a crisp white apron and black dress, her presence designed to be felt only as a seamless service. But she was not invisible. She was merely observing from a place no one thought to look. Her hands, steady as she cleared the tea service, did not betray the tremor in her soul. She had been a ghost for 3 years, ever since the fire of her former life as a nurse had been extinguished, leaving her in this grayscale existence of dust and silence. Tonight, however, colors were bleeding back in, sharp and dangerous. At the head of the heavy mahogany desk sat Chairman Kang Junseok, a man whose very stillness was a form of terrifying power. His face was a mask of iron control, but his hands, resting beside the white succession documents, were tense, the knuckles white beneath his tattoos. He was a predator at rest. Opposite him, Kang Tae-hyun smiled with the easy confidence of an heir who believed he had already won the throne. Between them, the air was thick with the scent of incense and lies. Tae-hyun was meant to be the bridge to the future, and Benny, with a medical knowledge that would have shocked every man in that room, knew the bridge was built on a lie. In the Kang estate, the dust was the only thing that moved without permission. It settled over the ancient cedar beams and the silk-screened partitions of the hanok with a patient, rhythmic persistence, a gray shroud over a world built on the rigid pillars of ancestry and blood. Benny Cross moved through this silence as a part of it, her life measured by the soft friction of a microfiber cloth against polished rosewood. To the family, she was merely a function of the house, as essential and as ignored as the air conditioning hum or the floorboards that never dared to creak under her weight. She had mastered the art of being a shadow, a ghost in a crisp white apron who saw the world through the reflection of the silver she polished. Her existence was defined by a practiced invisibility. She moved between the high-backed chairs of the great hall and the shadows of the sliding doors, her presence designed to be felt only as a seamless service, a phantom that kept the chairman's tea hot and his environment pristine. For 3 years, she had lived in this grayscale existence, a refuge she had built from the wreckage of her former life as a nurse. In that life, her voice had been her weapon, used to defend the integrity of medical records against a corporate fire that eventually consumed her career. Now, she kept her soul behind a mask of placid control, her hands steady as she performed the silent ballet of service. But the house was no longer still. A dissonance had begun to vibrate through the curated harmony of the estate, a subtle shift in the air that Benny felt in her very marrow. The looming shadow of the succession ceremony hung over the halls like a gathering storm. Chairman Kang Junseok, a man whose stillness was a form of terrifying power, sat more frequently in his study, his hands resting beside leather-bound folders with knuckles turned white. He was a predator at rest, watching his empire prepare for its next architect. Opposite him, Kang Tae-hyun moved with the easy, predatory confidence of a man who believed the throne was already his. Benny watched him from the periphery, observing the way he smiled, a practiced, melodic performance that never quite reached his eyes. Between the father and the alleged son, a bridge was being forged, a transition of power that promised to anchor the Kang legacy for another generation. Yet, as Benny cleared the dregs of bitter tea and smoothed the linens of the master suite, she felt the tremors of a compromised foundation. The colors of her life, once extinguished by the shame of her past, were beginning to bleed back in, sharp and dangerous. In the hushed grandeur of the estate, she wasn't just cleaning. She was auditing a betrayal that was unfolding molecule by molecule. She was a ghost who had started to see the cracks in the bridge. And for the first time in years, the silence of the house felt less like safety and more like a fuse waiting to be lit. The following Tuesday, the estate was a hive of silent, frantic preparation for the succession ceremony, but Benny was assigned to the periphery, the guest wing, where Tae-hyun maintained a suite that felt more like a cold corporate office than a home. In this sanctuary of glass and sharp edges, the dust was thinner, yet the secrets were denser. Ebony moved with her usual practiced invisibility, a ghost in a black dress, but her eyes were no longer passive observers of surface-level dirt. She was looking for the weak joint her father had once warned about, the structural flaw that could bring down a legacy. She found it not in a whispered conversation, but in the trash, a crumpled piece of high-grade stationery from a private clinic, discarded with a carelessness that spoke of T. Hyun's growing arrogance. As a former nurse, Ebony's mind was still wired to recognize the language of the body, a code more honest than any spoken word. She smoothed the paper against the cool marble of the vanity, her heart beginning a low, heavy drum against her ribs. It was a standard metabolic panel, the kind required for the high-value life insurance policies that accompanied a corporate succession. To a layman, it was a list of unremarkable numbers and chemical markers. To Ebony, it was a staggering audacity, a molecule-by-molecule betrayal of the chairman's history. She saw the blood type, AB-negative, and the markers for a rare hereditary enzyme deficiency. Her breath caught in the silent, gilded cage of the suite. Chairman Kang Junseok's medical history was something Ebony had studied with the hyper-focused intensity of a woman who once lived and breathed the nuances of diagnostic data. The chairman was type O, his late wife had been type O in the immutable laws of biology. The sun, standing in the hallway, was a physiological impossibility. T. Hyun was not the bridge to the future. He was a beautifully engineered catastrophe, a plant designed to mirror a father he shared no blood with. Ebony felt a cold fury rise within her, the same fire that had been extinguished years ago when she was framed for her integrity. She recognized the methodology of this deception, the confidence, the utter lack of conscience. This was not just a family secret, it was industrial sabotage of the highest order. As she tucked the paper into the hidden pocket of her apron, the gray existence she had cultivated for 3 years began to bleed into a sharp, dangerous red. She was no longer just a maid clearing the dust of a criminal empire. She was the only inspector on site who knew the foundation was a lie. The weight of her hidden knowledge was immense, a physical pressure building behind her eyes as she realized that to remain a ghost now was to be an accomplice to a murder of a legacy. The memory of the corporate fire always tasted like cold iron and hospital-grade disinfectant. Long before she was a ghost in the Kang estate, Ebony had been a woman of substance, a head nurse at St. Jude, who believed that a patient's chart was a sacred text. In those days, she didn't move with practiced invisibility. She moved with the earned authority of someone who held lives in her hands. She had believed with a crushing naivety that the truth was a shield. She didn't know then that it was actually a lightning rod. The fire hadn't been made of flames, but of ink and digital erasures. It began when she discovered that a major pharmaceutical conglomerate, the same kind of behemoth that destroyed the lives of those who dared to audit them, was falsifying the trial results for a new heart medication. They asked her to look the other way, to let a minor error in the code slide for the sake of the company's stock price. When she refused, the retaliation was molecule by molecule. First came the whispers of professional negligence. Then, the evidence began to shift. Logins she never made, medications she never signed for, a beautifully engineered catastrophe designed to frame her as the villain. Her supervisors, men who smiled with the easy confidence of those who held the superior position, watched with placid control as her career was extinguished. They didn't just fire her, they exhumed her reputation and burned it until only ash remained. She remembered her father's voice then, a man who had been a builder and understood that a bridge with one weak joint is a disaster waiting to happen. He had taught her that integrity was the only foundation that holds, but he hadn't warned her how lonely that foundation could be. The fallout left her in a grayscale existence, drowning in legal debts and stripped of the right to practice the only thing she loved. She had learned the hard way that the truth is the most dangerous thing you can own. It is a bridge burned before it is ever crossed. Now, standing in the opulent silence of the Kang guest wing with a fraudulent lab report in her pocket, the heat of that old fire began to lick at her soul again. For 3 years, she had sought safety in being a ghost, believing that if she were invisible, she could never be broken again. But as she looked at the reflection of her white apron in the polished mahogany, she realized she was at a crossroads. She could stay in the shadows, silent and safe, or she could step into the light and risk everything to expose the poison in the chairman's bloodline. The price of her name had been everything she once possessed, but as the colors of her past bled back in, sharp and dangerous, Abeni knew she could no longer afford the cost of her silence. The dining room of the Kang estate was a sanctuary of symmetry, where the light from the silk lanterns cast long, amber shadows against the sliding paper doors. It was a space designed for harmony, yet tonight, the air was thick with the scent of braised short ribs and a tension that felt like a drawn bowstring. Abeni moved around the perimeter of the table, her hands performing the rhythmic, silent labor of refilling tea cups, her eyes downcast, but her senses hypertuned to the man sitting to the chairman's left. Kang Ti-hyun was unraveling. It was a subtle disintegration, visible only to a ghost who knew how to look for the cracks. When Chairman Junseok spoke of the succession, of the sacred responsibility of the bloodline, and the need for absolute loyalty, Ti-hyun's easy, melodic confidence flickered. Abeni saw the way his fingers twitched against the fine porcelain, a dissonance in his carefully curated mask of control. He wasn't a predator at rest anymore. He was a cornered animal, realizing the walls were closing in. "The legacy is only as strong as the truth it is built upon," the chairman remarked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. His heavy brow was furrowed, his deep-set eyes searching his son's face with a sudden, sharp clarity that made Ti-hyun flinch. In that moment, the sun snapped. It wasn't a loud outburst, but a flash of defensive rage that burned through his polished exterior. "Why do you question me now?" Ti-hyun hissed, his voice a jagged edge in the quiet room. "I have given everything to this family. I have been the bridge you asked for." His eyes darted toward Abeni as she reached to clear a side dish, and for a heartbeat, the mask fell away entirely. It was a look of pure, murderous panic. The eyes of a man who realized that the invisible help might have seen the one thing he couldn't hide. Abeni felt the temperature of the room plummet. She saw Ti-hyun's knuckles turn white as he gripped his chopsticks, his posture hunched forward like a man preparing for a strike. Behind him, the bodyguard Han Du-yun remained expressionless, a silent consequence waiting in the shadows, but the air was now sharp and dangerous. Abeni realized then that Ti-hyun wasn't just ambitious, he was desperate. He was ready to kill to protect the lie, ready to extinguish any spark of truth before it could catch fire. The gray safety of her existence was gone, replaced by a cold, neon reality. The succession wasn't just a ceremony anymore. It was a countdown to a slaughter, and she was the only one holding the evidence that could stop the blade from falling. The door to Chairman Kang Junseok's private study was more than a barrier of heavy oak. It was the boundary of a sanctuary where the ghosts of the past met the cold calculations of the present. For 3 years, Abeni had passed this threshold only with a tray or a duster, her eyes fixed on the floorboards, a silent fixture of the room's ancient, curated honor. Tonight, she stood before it without an invitation, the smartphone in her apron pocket feeling like a live coal against her thigh. She knew that by entering unbidden, she was extinguishing the grayscale safety of her invisibility forever. She pushed the door open. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive ink. The chairman sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a predator at rest, framed by the symmetrical wooden beams of the Hanok architecture. He did not look up immediately, his hands, etched with the fatting ink of his history, still gripping the white succession documents. But the stillness in the room shifted. Han Du-yun, the bodyguard, moved like a silent consequence from the corner, his presence a chilling reminder of the violence that underpinned this piece. Abeni did not wait for the question that would surely lead to her dismissal. She stepped into the warm, soft lighting of the room, her movement a sharp dissonance against the tradition of the house. As the chairman finally lifted his heavy brow, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and mounting authority, Abeni reached into her pocket. Her hands, which had spent years clearing the dust of other people's lives, did not betray the tremor in her soul. She invaded his personal space, leaning over the desk, a breach of protocol that made the bodyguard tense, and thrust the smartphone screen toward him. The digital glow was a harsh, modern intrusion against the room's traditional grandeur. On the screen was the medical dissonance she had exhumed, the lab report that acted as a silent auditor of the bloodline. "Chairman," she said, her voice no longer a servant's whisper but the steady, clear tone of the woman she used to be. "The bridge you are building is compromised. Look at the markers. Look at the blood type." For a heartbeat, the room was a vacuum of sound. Hyun's name was not spoken, but his ghost was there, a beautifully engineered catastrophe now exposed to the light. The chairman's mouth opened slightly, his unfocused gaze drifting from the glowing screen to the paper in his hands. The colors were bleeding back in, sharp and dangerous. Ebony stood her ground, her face a mask of righteous resolve, knowing she had finally stopped being a ghost. She was the one holding the anchor, and the Empire was about to feel the weight of the truth. The light in the study seemed to thin, turning cold and brittle as Chairman Kang Junseok stared at the glowing screen of Ebony's phone. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the room was the low, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that had stood in that corner for 3 generations. The chairman's face, usually a fortress of iron-willed composure, began to fracture. The shock was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, tectonic shift that drained the color from his skin, leaving him looking aged and hollowed by the sudden weight of a 1,000-year lie. His hands, thick-fingered and etched with the dark ink of his violent ascension, reached out to touch the white succession document sitting on the mahogany desk. As his mind finally bridged the gap between the medical data Ebony provided and the man he called his son, his grip tightened. The fine paper crinkled under the pressure. His knuckles turned a sharp, skeletal white, the skin stretching taut over bone as he realized that the bridge he had spent 30 years building led to a precipice. The legacy he had protected with blood and shadow was not an anchor. It was a ghost. Hyun, the boy he had taught to lead, the man he had prepared to carry the Kang name into the next century, was a phantom, a beautifully engineered catastrophe designed by his enemies to hollow out the Empire from within. The realization turned his victory to ash in his mouth. He looked up at Ebony, and for the first time, the Predator's eyes were unfocused, clouded by the devastation of a man who had discovered he was the last of a dead line. The silence in the room became a vacuum, sucking the air from his lungs. Every sacrifice, every calculated cruelty, and every moment of pride he had felt watching Hyun move through these halls was now a mockery. He was a king without a kingdom, a father without a son, standing in a house filled with the echoes of a stolen future. The symmetry of the hanok around him, once a symbol of his control, now felt like the ribs of a cage. He looked down at his tattooed hands, hands that had built a fortress, and saw only the dust of the life he thought he knew. The corporate fire had finally reached the heart of the estate, and as the chairman's knuckles strained against the desk, the fire consumed the last of his illusions, leaving nothing but the cold, hard truth of his own isolation. The silence that followed Ebony's revelation was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, and cold, like the air in a deep-sea trench. Chairman Kang Junseok remained frozen, his eyes locked onto the glowing smartphone screen as if the digital pixels were acid eating through his long-held reality. The white succession documents beneath his hands, once the blueprint for his empire's future, now looked like a shroud. The devastating shock on his face was absolute, a man realizing that the legacy he had bled for was a house built on sand. A movement in the corner of the room broke the stasis. Han Du-yun, the bodyguard who had existed for years as a silent piece of the architecture, stepped forward. His transition from background to foreground was fluid and ominous, a physical manifestation of the shift in power. He did not ask for clarification. He did not need to. He saw the hollow, wrecked expression of his chairman and the righteous, unblinking fire in Ebony's eyes, and he understood that the harmony of the house had been a lie. The chairman finally looked up. The heartbreak that had momentarily softened his features was being replaced by something far more ancient and dangerous, the iron-fisted resolve of the predator he had once been. He stood slowly, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the desk that seemed to swallow the room. His hands, etched with the tattoos of his violent history, gripped the edge of the mahogany until the wood groaned. "Du-yun," the chairman said. His voice was no longer a rumble. It was a dry, chilling rasp, stripped of all warmth. The bodyguard stood at attention, his face an expressionless mask of stoic vigilance. He was a man of silent consequence, waiting for the one thing he was designed for, an order that required no explanation. "The succession is over," the chairman whispered, his gaze drifting toward the door where Taehyun's laughter could still be heard echoing faintly from the hallway. "The bloodline has been poisoned. Purge the household. Start with the son, and do not stop until every hand that touched this lie is cold. I want this estate cleaned not of dust, but of traitors." Abeni felt the temperature of the room drop to a lethal level. This was the final, chilling command she had both feared and invited. As Do-yeon bowed once, a sharp, disciplined movement, and turned to exit, the grayscale existence of the last 3 years was officially incinerated. The corporate fire of her past was nothing compared to the storm she had just unleashed. She stood beside the chairman, no longer a maid, and not yet an ally, watching the silent order set the empire's house ablaze. The bridge had been burned, and in the flickering light of the destruction, she realized she was the only one left standing in the wreckage with her integrity intact. The transition from the invisible, Maid to the indispensable auditor happened in the cold, blue light of the following dawn. The estate was no longer a sanctuary of ancient wooden beams and silk screens. It had become a command center, a fortress being scrubbed of its rot. Abeni did not return to her quarters to sleep. Instead, she stood in the center of the chairman's study, the white apron discarded, her sleeves rolled up with the clinical efficiency of the head nurse she had once been. Chairman Kang Junseok sat at his mahogany desk, his face a mask of iron-fisted resolve, but his eyes remained fixed on Abeni as she moved through the digital and physical records of his empire. She wasn't looking for dust anymore. She was looking for the termites, the structural weaknesses and falsified signatures that had allowed a pretender to climb so close to the throne. Using her deep medical background, she cross-referenced insurance filings, clinic visits, and blood donor records, her mind working with the hyper-focused intensity that had once made her a legend at St. Jude. "Here," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. She pointed to a series of offshore wire transfers disguised as medical research grants. "The funds for Taehyun's treatments weren't coming from your accounts, Chairman. They were coming from a subsidiary of the very conglomerate that framed me 3 years ago." The chairman leaned forward, his tattooed hands gripping the edge of the desk. He watched as Abeni connected the dots, moving between spreadsheets and legal documents with a practiced authority that would have shocked the men who had ignored her for years. She was no longer a ghost. She was a diagnostic surgeon, cutting away the dead tissue of his organization to save the heart. One by one, the termites were exposed. A corrupt family doctor, a high-ranking lieutenant who had facilitated the swap, and the digital engineers who had scrubbed the chairman's own records. As Abeni spoke, Han Do-yeon waited in the shadows, a silent consequence receiving the names like a list of debts to be collected. Abeni felt the heat of the old corporate fire beginning to fade, replaced by a new, sharp clarity. She was no longer running from her past. She was using the very skills they had tried to bury to rebuild a foundation that could not be shaken. The chairman, a man whose stillness was a form of terrifying power, finally looked up from the list of traitors. For the first time, he didn't look at her as a servant. He looked at her as the bridge builder, the only person in his world who possessed the integrity to tell him his house was falling. The grayscale existence was gone. In the rising sun, the world was bleeding back into sharp, dangerous color, and Abeni Cross was finally the one holding the lens. 6 months later, the Kang estate breathed with a different kind of silence. It was no longer the stifling, heavy quiet of a tomb built on secrets, but the steady, rhythmic pulse of a fortress with a cleared foundation. The spring air in the courtyard was cool, carrying the scent of blooming plum blossoms and damp earth, a vibrant contrast to the sterile, grayscale world Abeni had inhabited for so long. She stood near the central stone basin, watching the water ripple in the morning light, her reflection no longer distorted by the shadow of a servant's cap. The crisp white apron and black dress were gone, replaced by a tailored suit of deep charcoal that moved with a quiet, earned authority. She was no longer a ghost haunting the corridors, nor a master of dust, observing the world through the grime of other people's lives. Today, she was the one who held the folders, the one whose signature validated the integrity of the Empire's newest ventures. Chairman Kang Junseok emerged from the traditional wooden pavilion, his gait no longer heavy with the tension of a man waiting for the sky to fall. He stopped beside her, his tattooed hands clasped behind his back as they both looked out over the symmetrical beauty of the hanok. There was no need for the frantic whispers of the past. The termites had been purged. The corporate fire that had once threatened to consume them, both had been replaced by a hearth of mutual respect. "The architects are finishing the new medical wing in Seoul," the chairman said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "They asked for the final audit. I told them no one sees the structural flaws quite like you." Benny felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of alignment that had been missing since the day her career at St. Jude was incinerated. She had discovered that her father was right. The strongest structures are not made of stone or steel, but of the courage to remain upright when the world tries to bend you. The truth had been a dangerous thing to own. A bridge burned before it was crossed, but in the wreckage of that fire, she had discovered a truth even more profound. You do not honor a legacy by hiding from the fire. You honor it by becoming the light that reveals the path through the smoke. As she turned to follow the chairman back into the study, no longer to clear tea, but to lead a nationwide negotiation, Benny caught a glimpse of her hands. They were steady. They were the hands of a builder. The grayscale existence was a memory, a ghost she had finally laid to rest. In its place was a life of sharp, dangerous, and beautiful color, built on the only foundation that could never be burned, the truth. She was a Benny Cross, and for the first time in years, she was finally whole.